Good morning. I hope everybody's ready for a good week. I hope everybody had a great weekend, and we're going to wrap up this book. I hope everybody's enjoyed reading it. I talked to people in class on Friday. A lot of people thought that the plot of The Life We Bury had kept their interest a little bit more. I hope that as we get to the tail end here and we're dealing with the solving the mystery of Ariel's death, that some of the plot details pick up for you. And I hope that this has been an enjoyable experience as we wrap this up this week. Speaking of wrap ups, remember that today's April 12th, so Group B is in class. Group A, you're the ones watching this. We'll see you in class on Wednesday, and we're just going to kind of be wrapping this up as we go through the final parts of the book. The quiz over Ordinary Grace will be on Monday the 19th. And the book review will be due next Wednesday, the 21st at 11:59 p.m. Please have a copy of one paragraph of your book review in the daily writing for Friday. That's going to be your daily writing. I'll remind you on Wednesday. I'll remind you on Friday. I'll be working with Melissa, Morgan, Brady, and Josh in class on their daily writings, trying to get that fixed up. And I hope to have everyone's commented on by Monday the 19th so that you have a little bit of an idea of what should be good, what should be bad, what should be fixed um, before you finish up the final copy on the 21st. One of the things that I'm looking at with this book is there enough 1961 or is there too much 2014 when the book was published or 2021? And I do think there's mention of Mad Magazine and there's Alfred E. Neuman here up on the screen, and it's going to be a mad year in 1961. But in 2021, we're taking a look at Facebook and deleting your Facebook account and Instagram and TikTok. And I'm sure there's some social media that I haven't heard of yet. And I think it's a different time. And 2021 was dealing with Facebook, or 2014, excuse me, was dealing with Facebook. Um, there were people splitting off on what was real news and what was fake news then. All of those things have gotten bigger and louder. Mad Magazine seems a little quaint in comparison. I think if I take a look at social issues, and when I taught an adolescent lit class, I talked about what was called the problem novel. And in the problem novel, we were dealing with the social issue of the week. And by social issues, I'm talking about things like bullying, teen pregnancy, all of the things you see here, domestic abuse, suicide, how to properly treat people with disabilities, immigration and migrant workers are an issue now, Native American issues. We're dealing with sexuality, and legislatures are dealing with all sorts of bills about transgender students in sports, and certainly there are people talking about the effect of COVID and whether that will have uh, some PTSD effects on people, especially people in areas that were locked down tighter than South Dakota. So I think social issues are things that are certainly worth covering in novels. The question I have is, are there too many of them in this book, and are they too 2021 or too 2014 and not enough 1961? Bullying. I think that we started that on 24, page 24. And what did people offer him? They made fun of him, Christian folks, and they said things to him hurtful as throwing stones. So we have this idea of verbal bullying, and we have the idea that it was adults. Gus, I think, is calling out adults for bullying. And I think in the 1960s, this picture I have on the slide is a picture from the Andy Griffith Show. It was set in Mayberry. It was set in a small town, and bullying was usually, one kid bullying another kid, and then the whole plot seemed to revolve around, you put the bully in his place by you punch him in the nose once, and then everybody goes back to being friends. This certainly seems to be a more serious treatment of the issue than was on popular culture and in popular fiction, um, television from the 1960s. And so I think it's perhaps treated much more seriously. It's perhaps treated better here, but is it to 2021? Teen pregnancies, if you take a look, the late 1950s, the early 1960s were a high point for birth rates per 1,000 females ages 15 to 19. So Ariel's teen pregnancy in 1961 would have not been something that would have been shocking. What might have been shocking, obviously, is that she's the pastor's daughter. What might have been shocking is she probably, um, you know, wasn't going to marry the father of the child, as we play that out. Um, and so there are, I think, a whole bunch of side issues with the pregnancy, but I do think that this is one that I think the book got right. Um, that late 1950s, early 1960s was one of the high points of teen pregnancy in the United States. And so it's a social issue that belongs there, even if we think about the fact that perhaps it was not discussed openly. I think Kruger does a great job here of putting that into perspective. Domestic abuse. If you take a look, the McClintock movie, I think, came out in the 1960s, 62, 63, something like that. And I think, there's this scene in the movie where John Wayne spanks Maureen O'Hara. And nobody seemed to care much one way or the other. And in fact, I think there's a double spanking scene at the end. It seems as if domestic abuse in popular culture in the 1960s was pushed under the rug a little bit. Here, I think we take a look at it, and again, it's dealt with in a much more serious manner. I just don't know if it's a manner that fits 1961. What did you expect her friends to say? That her husband had hit her and she was embarrassed to show the bruises in public? And it should be not just her, he hit Peter too. And the idea of, kids getting hit upside the head, kids with bruises, were part of the 1960s. Domestic abuse has always been an issue. And I do think it's probably an important one to be brought up. Again, I just don't know if the manner in which it's brought up quite ties into the 1960s. But again, it happened. It was depicted in public. It was sometimes laughed at in other forms of pop culture of the 1960s. The homeless and itinerates. The idea of mental illness and with homelessness is something we've come to accept. Again, in the 1960s, there seemed to be a lot of laughing at homelessness and itinerants. The picture on the slide is Red Skelton. He is playing a character that he created called Freddie the Freeloader. And Freddie the Freeloader was a hobo. He was an itinerant. He was homeless. And yet it was the source of a lot of sketches on the variety show, The Red Skelton Show. And we weren't dealing with the idea of mental illness and homelessness. It was just, laziness, if nothing else. And it became sort of a running joke throughout the show. And this was a carryover from a radio program where he played all these sorts of characters as well. And so, again, I think it's important to take a look at how seriously they're talking about it. And this is Doyle, who is not, the most caring of characters in the novel, making this statement. Abuse of power. We see Doyle doing the spray painting, doing the vandalism. And in the 1960s, you had Dragnet, and the cops were all decent and upstanding. We wouldn't dream of them abusing power, okay? Or if they did, they were the one bad apple. And as we've gone through the past 2 or 3 summers, and we've had a lot of issues with police and police shootings, um, Doyle's action here seems perhaps a little bit quaint as well. Just the idea that he spray painted the truth where the world can see it, and that he was using his office to get back at people that he thought were living above their station, rubbing their noses in it. Dragnet would have never had cops acting like that. And so, again, I'm not saying that cops didn't do what Doyle did. I'm not saying that it's not an accurate depiction of a small town in 1961. In fact, I think it probably is. I'm just saying that the pop culture of the 1960s treated all of these things differently than Kruger treats it in the book. The wealth gap, again, I think if you take a look at, the wealth gap in the 1960s, 1962 is shown here on screen compared to now, or compared to 2012 from this chart, and I think it's gotten wider since then. Again, it's an issue worth talking about. The rich we've always had with us, but I do think this view of the rich and the plantation and the white pillared mansion perhaps ties in more with how things were depicted. There was the movie in the 1960s starring Sidney Poitier as a black cop, and the rich guy lived up on the hill in a white pillared mansion. That, I think, ties in fairly closely with how pop culture depicted the rich. And yes, the rich were sometimes seen as, thinking that they were way above everybody and that they were acting as royalty, whether they were in the Midwest, the Deep South, or wherever. Suicide rate, the top line, or suicide by gender, and I think the top line is 20s from 1950s, and this one's the 1970s, and it's by gender. And again, you can kind of see gaps jumping up and down, and as we go through here, and it's always been an issue, and I think the book deals with it in a fairly realistic fashion. The idea of living with people with disabilities. I can't remember the exact map for all of this, but I just want to point out that there was a school for the deaf, there was a school for the blind and visually impaired, along with other state institutions, and worrying about having her sent off to a school for the deaf and special tutors, and the idea that she had no future as far as anybody could see, I think is a pretty accurate depiction of the time. And look, I don't recall a lot of people with disabilities, especially blind or hearing disabilities. Helen Keller's pop culture standing not, to the contrary. In fact, the first person with a disability that I remember seeing on TV was the cop Ironside, who was in a wheelchair. And I do think that a lot of these things are depicted accurately. And I do think that this one's a good reminder that there was a lot of spots in history where the people with disabilities were just kind of shoveled off into special schools away from the general public. Migrant workers. Cesar Chavez and the strikes, grapes and lettuce in particular, of the late 1960s, early 1970s, were things that I read about for current events classes in high school. This discussion, I think, is a discussion that people are still having. What is the role of migration? How do we get the work done that we need to get done? How do we fill all of the jobs that need to be filled in agriculture? This discussion, again, is one I don't know what would have happened in 1961. I was 4. But I do think it's, again, a reminder that this is an issue that has crossed time. It was an issue in the 1960s. It's an issue now. And I'm guessing it'll be an issue in 2020 or 2031, excuse me. Native American. The book you see here is a book that was in my would have been in my grade school library. Um, there was a certain celebration of Native Americans in some of those books. Other of the books, I think, treated them rather stereotypically. But we never talked about the idea of 38 of our warriors were hung in one day and the whites who watched it cheered. We didn't talk about looking at things from a Native American point of view. And so I do think, once again, it's not that there weren't issues like that. It's not that people didn't talk about issues like that. It's that the, to use the word, it's the angle that Kruger takes seems to me to be something a little bit different than what people would have taken, or the vast majority of people would have taken in the 1960s. And I do, as we keep going here, there's a lot of social issues packed into a book that's a coming of age book and a murder mystery. And one can argue whether or not he perhaps did too many things as he tried to put it together. And by the way, if you look on Amazon, I think any copies of this book now are like $500 or $600. And again, you've got the idea of homosexual and not using the word fag in the book, and the idea that one used it as a slur is certainly accurate through most of my youth. And I do think it's a quick reminder of how things were. I just don't know how many ministers' wives would have been as open as Ruth was, and would have been as kind and caring as Ruth was. Now, again, there's this phrase about artists and things like that. That would be fine. And also, I think it's important to understand that in 1969, the Stonewall riot occurred, and I think it's important to take a look at the report with the last sentence here. At the time, however, the clash was treated largely as a local news item reported only in New York City. Time, for one, never covered the initial conflagration. In other words, issues about gay rights, issues about transgender weren't covered. It wasn't talked about. They were pushed underneath the rug completely. And the fact that the family was having these open discussions about the use of the word homosexual or versus the use of slurs, I think, again, I just don't know if it's quite accurate to the time period. I think it's important to point out that there have been issues and laws around sexual orientation forever, and the struggle for equal rights has been a part of that struggle forever. And 69 is not that far away from 61. But I do think for the Midwest in 1961, would Ruth have been that open? The people in class will be watching this George Carlin video about use of language with post-traumatic stress disorder versus shell shock versus some other things. The link for this is down below. I urge you to give it a watch. I know I've put a lot of Carlin in here, but I do think that Carlin understands what language is all about. And so I do urge you to give this a watch. And then finally, your daily writing. Is the book too filled with 2021 social and cultural issues? And more importantly, I think, is it too full of 2021 attitudes about these social and cultural issues? Yes or no? And you can say that, yes, it's too full, but it's supposed to be. That's a good idea, that we can't divorce ourselves from the time of 2014 any more than the people in 1961 could divorce themselves from that time. All of that is fine. I just want to get your opinions on how the book dealt with about a dozen social issues as we go. And we'll see you in class on Wednesday. And if you have any questions, just shoot me an email.